Welcome back to Chapter 7. This is part 2 of our lecture on South and East Asia. In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about population and demographics, as well as religion and language in the region. So over half the world's population lives in this region, and it's an incredible amount of people. We have 1.3 billion in China, 1.2 billion in India, compared to about the 370 million that live in the United States. Most countries, however, are still rural. We're going to learn that there are a lot of megacities in these regions, but most of the people who live in this region are still living in rural settings. And so when we look at populations, though, some of them are incredibly dense. In Bangladesh, we have 169 million people, and so there is an outline of Bangladesh laid over Southern California. So you can imagine in Metro San Diego, there's about 2.3 million people, 169 million people living in Bangladesh. In the Philippines, we have 101 million. I'm not going to ask you these numbers on an exam. I'm just trying to give you kind of ideas about the sheer amount of people who live there. Indonesia, 256 million. On the island of Java alone, there are 145 million people. Vietnam, 94 million. Pakistan, 199 million people. So very large populations in these countries. And if we look at a cartogram here of the region, looking at, this each box of this size equals 10 million people, right? China and India have the majority of the population in the region, Indonesia quite a bit, and then smaller populations in places like Mongolia, Taiwan, Nepal. And there's a bunch of diversity with respects to percentages that are urban, per capita GDP, and that annual rate of natural increase. So if you look at a country like Afghanistan, you have pretty high rate of natural increase, right? Not a lot of access to things like family planning here. Pretty low on the Human Development Index, only a 0.3. Remember, 1 is a perfect score, which no country has. Only 22% of the populations are living in urban settings, and a very low per capita GDP. As opposed to a place like Japan, which actually their population is shrinking. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Really, really high on the Human Development Index, 0.9, one of the highest countries in the world. 86% of the population is urban, and a much, much higher per capita GDP. And then countries that are kind of in between, right? India is considered an emerging economy. They have a growing middle class, lower rate of natural increase, much lower than Afghanistan, higher rate on the Human Development Index, but still lots of poverty. Nowhere near the per capita GDP of Japan, but certainly, at least 4 times as much as that of Afghanistan. But still a pretty rural country, right? Only 29% of the people are living in cities. And China is another example of that. We're going to talk about why this rate of natural increase in China is so very low, right? It's a 0.5 compared to India's 1.5. While they have similar scores on the Human Development Index, they are more urban than India, and they have about twice the GDP per capita that India has. And so we look at population structures, right? We have countries in all stages of development. So less developed countries like Laos, right? We have a young population with high dependency. More developed countries like South Korea, we have aging populations. You can see here, right? That population bubble is much more protruding in those older age groups. China has a relatively low Human Development Index, but a low growth rate. And so the question is like, what happened in China where you have really this low growth that looks a lot more like a very developed country than compared to where it is on the development index. And so the answer to that is China's one-child policy. So during the 1980s, the population there was growing really, really rapidly. And so in order to combat this growth, they made a one-child policy, which means that every couple in the country was only allowed to have one child. And if you had more than one child, you had to pay a pretty steep price to do that. And so it worked. Growth rates slowed down considerably. The doubling time for the country's population went from 22 years to 140 years. But there were several negative consequences. There were double standards for rich and poor people. And so, if you are wealthy and you can afford to pay the fee and have a second child, you could have a second child. There were a lot of people who were forced to be sterilized because they could not afford to have more children. And it's a culture that favors boys. So, unfortunately, there was a lot of infanticide and abandonment of girls. This is a place in Beijing, I believe, where you could drop off a baby, no questions asked. So you could just drop this baby off in this window because it is more economically advantageous to have boys in China than to have girls. So if you were only going to have one child, unfortunately, a lot of girls were abandoned. Ultrasounds that would tell you the sex of the child were outlawed. And then there's this little emperor syndrome that's happening. So you have these boys who, because they're the only child in the family, are incredibly spoiled. Issues with human trafficking. Right now we have these men coming to marrying age, and there aren't enough wives in the country for them. So the policy was repealed in 2015. Now people are allowed to have a max of 2 children. In India, it looks quite different. So there is a democracy in India, unlike the communist law of China. So there's no chance of a one-child policy. Like they're not gonna vote for that. So they're working on increasing sex education, access to contraception. They have similar issues of male favoritism in that country as well. So that growth is still high, but mostly in rural settings. But it is actually slowing down. And they are expected to surpass China, though, population-wise by 2040, mainly due to the effects of China's one-child policy. Japan, on the other hand, has an aging population. They are very urban. They are also having slow economic growth right now. So they're a very wealthy country, but their economy is not growing, so they're not really attracting people coming into the country. A lot of people in Japan culturally are just not interested in marrying or having sex for that matter. There's a clip from an article I'll show you on the next page about that. They have very little immigration due to their slow economic growth, and so they're having issues with lots of elderly dependents. So you can see here this population bubble, right? It's really that elderly population that's going up. Working population is going down. Population overall is going down. This is an article from The Guardian from a couple of years ago. Why have young people in Japan stopped having sex? A lot of young people in Japan are just not very interested in having relationships. And so Japan is trying to figure out ways to combat that shrinking population problem that they have. And the question is like, how is it possible to have so many people in this region? And it's by feeding them, right? We learned way back when at the beginning of the class that one of the things that your population size is dependent upon is how much food you can grow for them. And so rice really defines the region. It requires a lot of labor, but you also get a lot of food out of rice. And you can see this is average rice regional output. It's really this region that is primarily producing lots and lots of rice. So it is a staple food, in nearly every country in the region, right? All of them eat a lot of rice. And more developed countries, however, though, are relying more on imports from less developed countries, because again, it's a very labor-intensive crop, and so when you have a wealthier population, they're less interested in working in rice fields. And if you think about first world versus third world farming, it looks very different, right? This is what wheat farming looks like in the U.S. It's very industrialized, lot less people. For certain crops, we still need quite a few people for a lot of crops in the U.S., but generally speaking, big machinery, massive harvests, as opposed to what rice farming looks like in Asia, right? It's very labor intensive. You need a lot of human input there. The Green Revolution came about in the mid-20th century, which is part of the reason why populations there are so big. And so basically, a lot of agricultural technology was developed to increase food output. This includes synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, as well as selective breeding of crops, which makes crops more resilient to a variety of environmental mechanisms. And so more food meant more people. And it saved many lives as well. But there were some environmental problems that come along with this increased agricultural technology. One, you have more resource consumption. Fertilizers are made from, they are very fossil fuel intensive. So you're using a lot of resources there. You're using a lot more water if you're growing a lot more food. And those fertilizers and pesticides can also be harmful. Just really quick too, if you can see here, really, if we look at world rice production, right, it has really just totally kept up with population growth. A lot of people are worried about population growth and food shortages, but in the case of rice production, it has definitely kept up with or outpaced it. Next, we're going to talk about rural to urban migration, which is a trend in other regions, but certainly a trend in South and East Asia. Village life is pretty difficult. Right, and so there is also less agricultural labor needed, partly from that green revolution that we just talked about. And so people are moving to cities. So here is a hill tribe village in northern Thailand that I've visited, and there 20 miles away is the city of Chiang Mai. So lots of people leaving this kind of rural village life in order to find work. So for example, in China, it was 26% urban in 1990 and it's 50% urban today, which is a huge, huge difference. So that demographic transition, going from that rural to urban setting is very active in this region. And so if we look at cities like Shanghai in 1990, it had 13 million people, and that's what the skyline of Shanghai looked like. It has 23 million people as of 2013, and that is now what the skyline looks like. Incredible development of cities very, very quickly, especially in China. So we have a ton of major Chinese cities. And if you want to think about how many cities that you can name off the top of your head that are major Chinese cities, and I asked this in my in-person class, people will say, oh, Beijing, Shanghai, and it kind of stops there if you're not from China. It's not that many that you can name, but there are actually about 90 cities in China that have over 1 million people in it. One, just for fun, Shijiazhuang, which I'm sure that I'm pronouncing terribly, has 10.4 million people, and it looks like this, right? Huge, cities that basically pop up overnight almost, in order to accommodate this really large manufacturing sector in China. And we'll talk about economies and manufacturing and kind of their effects. But, 90 cities in China of over 1 million people is pretty significant. And we have mega cities in other parts of the regions too. These really massive cities, 37 million people in Tokyo, 21 in Mumbai, Seoul has 25 million, Beijing is 19 million. You think about San Diego, the city proper has 1.2 million people. Even New York has about 8 or 9 million people. So these just really dense, massive cities. Right, and so if we look at a neighborhood in Hong Kong, very, very densely populated, right, where you're talking about having 340,000 people per square mile. That is incredibly dense. Next, we're going to move on to language in the region, which is very, very diverse. Language is a unifier in several countries, including Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar, where you have one main language, right? Most people in Japan speaking Japanese, most people in Korea speaking Korean. But China and India are very, very diverse language-wise. And then on the islands, in Indonesia and the Philippines, you have a lot of language diversity. There's also many different writing systems in the region. And there's a few here. Here's Thai and Khmer, which is spoken in Cambodia, Lao, Hindi, there's Chinese characters. Some use a Latin-based writing system. This is Malay. Vietnamese also uses a Latin-based writing system that's spelled out kind of phonetically to us. Japanese characters, Korean, tons of different types of writing systems in a pretty small, not a small area, but in a concentrated area, right, you have a lot of different writing systems. And so if we look at language in China, right, we can see Mandarin is the first language of about 900 million people, and that's what we typically think of when we think of Chinese. But there are many, many dialects. So if you live in completely different parts of China, you might have trouble understanding each other's Mandarin. There are other related languages, including Cantonese, Wu, Zhang, Minbai. But the characters are all written the same, but the language is spoken slightly differently. Then you have unrelated languages in the north and the west. So we have, some Russian here. We have, I believe this is Arabic. There's a KFC in Inner Mongolia that has a variety of language styles on it. When you look at language in India, there is more diversity than China. There are 30 languages. There are way more than 30 languages, but 30 languages are spoken by more than 1 million people. So again, incredibly diverse, large numbers of people speaking completely different languages that have completely different writing systems, which is also pretty unique. You think about the United States, right? We have a lot of people obviously speaking English, but also a lot of people speaking Spanish, but it's the same writing system. They use English and Hindi as the lingua franca, or the language of business and commerce, and what most people speak. Many people speak multiple languages. English is a holdover from when they were a British colony. And federal structures gives recognition to languages, right? They're very culturally important to a lot of people. We've talked about this in other regions. So there are many, many identified national languages, and because those cultural and political identities are rooted in those languages. When we look at languages in the islands, here's Indonesia and the Philippines. When you have isolation, it can cause a lot of language difference and diversity. So even though these languages may be related, they've kind of evolved into their own languages. And so there's been government efforts in Indonesia and in the Philippines to promote national language as a way to kind of have this national identity. So Tagalog, which is Filipino, or Bahasa in Indonesia, as a way to kind of make everybody feel like they are Indonesian or Filipino. Lastly, in this part, we're going to talk about religion in the region, which the dominant religions in the region are Hinduism and Buddhism. They are the most popular. They are related to each other, which we'll talk about a little bit. Then you also have quite large areas of Islam, mostly in Pakistan and Bangladesh, in Indonesia and Malaysia. There are certainly people practicing Islam in other countries, but those are their main concentrations. And then we have Christianity, mostly in the Philippines and in South Korea. And then Confucianism and Taoism, which we'll also talk about a little bit, which is mostly kind of spread throughout China. And lots of atheism also in the region, in addition to this diversity of religions. And so first we'll talk about Hinduism, which most of India and Nepal practices Hinduism. It's really only here, plus the Indian diaspora. And what I mean by the Indian diaspora is Indians who have left India who are now practicing their religion in other countries. It is very diverse in beliefs and practices. It is polytheistic, so there are many, many, many gods. On the bottom here, you can see a picture of an image of Vishnu and Lakshmi. They believe in the idea of reincarnation, right? So this is just one life that you are living, and you are going to come back as something else. And they believe in the ideas of dharma and karma. So dharma is like your duty to do things, and karma is kind of that like goodwill is probably the wrong word, but that good that you breed into the world that comes back to you. And that is manifested in something called the caste system, which I'll talk about a little bit on the next slide. And so the caste system is a class-based hierarchy that exists in India, and it is hereditary. So if you are born into a specific caste, you are in that caste for your entire life. You have no option to move to another caste. You are just part of that caste system. So the mobility of the caste system in the eyes of Hinduism is that, through good karma and doing your dharma, you could be born into a different caste, but you cannot move into a different caste in your lifetime. And so dharma is your duty as part of your caste. There are these individuals called the Dalit, which are the untouchables. They have no caste, and they only do what is considered like unclean jobs. It is illegal to discriminate based upon caste, but it certainly still happens frequently. Here is an ad for housing, for I don't know if this is for renting or purchasing some type of property, and it says only Brahmins, which is the highest caste in India. There is less interaction between castes, but that is starting to change, especially as people are becoming more urban in India. There's starting to be more interaction between castes. The next religion we're going to talk about is Buddhism, which is an offshoot of Hinduism. They also believe in the ideas of reincarnation and karma. There are no gods. Buddha is divine, but he is not God. And so this idea of spiritual oneness, it started in India and then diffused to East Asia. And it permeates the culture of Southeast Asia. If you visited Southeast Asia, there are Buddhist temples everywhere. Here's a small one that I visited in Ayutthaya, Thailand. And it also combines with other religions in East Asia. So Buddhism is not like a kind of mutually exclusive religion, right? You couldn't say like, oh, I'm a Christian, but I'm also a Muslim. But in Buddhism, you certainly can practice multiple things. And so it combines with things like Shinto in Japan or Confucianism and Taoism in China and Taiwan. And so Buddhist monks are an everyday sight in Thailand, right? They are pretty much everywhere. It is not uncommon for young men to be a monk for a year in their life and then kind of just as something that they do for a year and then they go back to secular society. The next is Confucianism and Taoism, and these are really Chinese socio-political spiritual philosophies, kind of more than religion. They predate communism. They're about 2,600 years old, and they're not truly religious, so they're not at odds with communism. Communism is very anti-organized religion and anything that kind of threatens the state, and these guys do not fall underneath that. And plus, the practices of Confucianism are really aligned well with communism. They're all about order and respect for elders and a hierarchy. And Taoism is about finding the way and balance and harmony and almost about inaction. So again, these jive very well with communism, so they're not suppressed under communism. Taoism kind of has a sort of polytheistic gods. They're kind of more akin, though, to patron saints, as you would think of in kind of Catholicism. Just so kind of these like very important individuals who lived that you might pray to, but they're not gods. So in China, there is certainly a lot of suppression of religion. They are against any highly organized religion. And here you can see the government here is calling a particular church an evil cult. So they are against any beliefs that are antithetical to communism. And there are similar issues to this in Vietnam and Laos as well. Oops, excuse me, I hit my button too fast. So that is the end of Chapter 7, Part 2. And next you are going to complete a small activity, and then you're going to move on to Part 3 of the lecture.